No one detected the human fleet's arrival, then an entire empire vanished. Overnight, the ship was dark when I opened my eyes. Not the kind of dark you get when you turn off a light, the kind of dark that has weight, the kind that presses against your face and reminds you that there is nothing outside the hull except 300 trillion miles of nothing in every direction. My name is Mara Voss. I am the commanding Admiral of the United Human Colonial Fleet 7th Strike Arm. I am 46 years old. My hands have not been warm in 11 months. I did not give the order to heat the ship. I never did. The crew of the carrier ship Arlen knew this when they signed on. Every single one of the 412 people aboard this vessel knew that the internal temperature would be held at 4 degrees above freezing for the entire transit. They knew their breath would fog in front of their faces every morning. They knew the coffee would go cold in 90 seconds. They knew their joints would ache and their skin would crack at the knuckles and their sleep would be shallow and broken. They signed on anyway. All 318 ships of the 7th Strike Arm were the same, powered down to the minimum threshold needed to keep the crew alive. No active engines, no outgoing transmissions, no navigation beacons, no heat blooms in the infrared spectrum. Every hull coated in 7 layers of metamaterial plating that absorbed radar, scattered LiDAR, and radiated exactly to 7 degrees Kelvin, the background temperature of deep space itself. From the outside, we looked like rocks. That was the point. I've been planning this for 11 years. Not alone, there were engineers, physicists, navigators, tacticians, and a small group of very quiet people whose job titles I was never allowed to write down, but the core idea was mine, and it was simple. The Volkai Empire had never been surprised in 400 years of expansion because their sensor network was perfect. You could not sneak up on them with a fast ship. Speed produced heat produced a signal produced an intercept produced annihilation. Every civilization that had tried to challenge them had tried to be faster, or more powerful, or more clever in the moment of engagement. Every one of them had been detected before they arrived and incinerated before they could fire. So we decided not to be fast. We decided to be slow, slower than anything in the galaxy had ever deliberately moved toward a target. 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days, that was how long we had been drifting, not flying, drifting, riding gravitational slingshots around brown dwarfs and gas giants, following trajectories that had been calculated a full decade in advance. Ballistic arcs, no corrections, no adjustments after the first 6 months. If you adjusted course, you fired a thruster. If you fired a thruster, you produced a heat signature. If you produced a heat signature, you were detected and you were finished. We had locked in our course and then gone quiet, and we had stayed quiet, and now we were here. Here was the outer edge of the Volkai home system. The star ahead of us burned pale blue and enormous in the forward scopes. I could see the orbital platforms on long-range passive sensors. Enormous things, ringed with weapons. Arrays bristling with detection. Equipment that could find a single warm body at 2 light-years distance. Not a single alert had been triggered. I looked around the bridge. Lieutenant Commander Owen Hale sat at the tactical station, his face pale and his eyes steady. Navigator Petra Dunn was watching her. Screens with the focused calm of someone who has been watching screens for 3 years and has learned not to blink at unexpected readings. Flight Officer Conrad Webb was running pre-activation checks on the main drive with the quiet efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this moment so many times that it had stopped feeling real and started feeling like muscle memory. None of them spoke. We had gone to full silence protocol 6 hours ago. Even our internal communications were text only, routed through fiber lines rather than wireless, because wireless produced electromagnetic radiation and electromagnetic radiation produced signal. I picked up the mechanical watch from the console, my grandfather's watch. Wound by hand, no battery, no signal, no electronic component of any kind. I had carried it since we left the Aldrich Memorial Docks. I wound it now, the small clicking of the gears, the loudest sound on the bridge. 5 hours and 40 minutes. That was how long until every ship in the fleet would simultaneously ignite their drives. The plan was precise because it had to be. The Valkyrie sensor net could handle a single detection event. It could handle 10. It had been designed to process and respond to any threat that appeared in their space. What it had never been tested against, what no one had ever tried, was 318 ignition events occurring at the exact same moment from positions already inside the sensor perimeter, already inside the minimum response radius of the defense grid. You can build a fence as tall as you like. It does not help if the people you are trying to keep out are already in the yard. I should say something here before the next 5 hours begin about why we were doing this. 14 years ago, a colony vessel named the Aldrich was traveling through what was, at the time, unclaimed space between human territory and the outer edge of Valkyrie expansion. The Aldrich carried 40,000 people, families, mostly children, people who had sold everything they owned for a berth on that ship because they believed the new colony world on the other side would be worth it. The Valkyrie had recently decided that the route the Aldrich was using fell within their newly declared expansion corridor. They did not hail the ship. They did not warn the ship. They fired on it once with a weapon designed to disable, and when it did not immediately stop, they fired again with something considerably larger. 40,000 people. There were 11 survivors found 3 weeks later in a lifeboat by a passing service vessel. One of them was a 6-year-old girl named Lucy Farrow, who had been placed in the lifeboat by her mother 40 seconds before the second weapon hit. Lucy's mother did not make it to the lifeboat. The Valkyrie sent a formal communication to the Colonial Council afterward. It said essentially that the corridor had been clearly marked in their internal navigation charts, that human vessels had been advised through proper diplomatic channels, and that the incident was regrettable but lawful. The Colonial Council sent a formal response asking for reparations and a full inquiry. The Valkyrie sent back 3 words. The words translated to, "You are welcome." I keep a copy of that communication in my personal file. I have read it every morning for 11 years, not out of hatred. I want to be honest about that. I did not build this fleet out of hatred. Hatred clouds your thinking and leads to poor trajectory calculations. I built it out of something quieter and colder than hatred, something that does Not have a clean name in any language. No, a refusal to let an act of that size go unanswered, a conviction that a civilization which fires on 40,000 sleeping people and then sends a message that says you are welcome has made a choice about what kind of neighbor it intends to be. And that choice deserves a response in kind. We were the response. On my screen, a soft indicator blinked. A text message from the Lethbridge, one of the lighter escort carriers 4,000 km. To my port side. It read, thermal seal on cargo bay. 7 has been reading unstable for 6 days. Chief Engineer Layla Burke requests permission to run a brief systems diagnostic using active sensors. I stared at it. An active sensor sweep, even a brief one, even a narrowband diagnostic ping, lasting 2 seconds would produce a detectable electromagnetic signature. We were 5 hours and 38 minutes from ignition. I typed back permission denied, seal the bay manually and have the crew in. That section moved forward, accepted. Risk. There was a pause, then understood. No. Complaint from this end. I set the watch back on the console. I looked at the pale blue star ahead of us and thought about Layla Burke and her crew sealing a compromised bay by hand. In the dark and cold, moving through corridors lit only by emergency strips, and not complaining about it. That was the thing about the people on these ships. I had asked them to do something that no military doctrine in human history had prepared them for, not a fast assault, not a brave charge. 3 years of cold, quiet endurance in the dark with no certainty that it would work, with the full knowledge of what would happen if it did not, and they had done it without breaking, without a single signal leak in 3 years, and 2 months across 318 vessels. I wound the watch again, even though it did not need winding yet. 4 hours and 50 minutes. Outside, the Volcay home system burned, blue and silent, completely unaware that 318 stones had arrived in its yard. I sat back in my chair and waited. The report that crossed Director Sethka Alvrin's desk at 3:40 Imperial Standard Time was 9 lines long and listed as low priority. He almost did not read it. Sethkai was 63 years old and had served the Volcay Empire's intelligence directorate for 4 decades. He had seen empires rise and fall on the intelligence he gathered. He had watched civilizations make the mistake of underestimating Volcay reach and then watch what happened to those civilizations afterward. He had approved 17 deep space interdiction actions. He had written the foundational doctrine on early threat detection that the entire Imperial sensor network now ran on. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most informed being in the known galaxy about threats to the Volcay Empire. He read the 9-line report because his evening meal was running late and he had nothing else to do with his hands. The report was filed by a junior analyst named Urbikai, a young officer assigned to stellar drift monitoring, the most boring posting in the entire intelligence apparatus. Urbikai's job was to review automated mass differential readings from the outer system buoys and flag anything that showed unexpected gravitation variance. In 4 years he had filed exactly 0 flags of consequence. Sethkai knew his name only because the directorate required him to review all submissions, however minor. The report stated that gravitation mass differential readings in the outer system, specifically in a band between The fourth and fifth orbital shells were showing an accumulated variance of 0.003%. Above baseline, Urbikai noted that the variance had been building slowly over the preceding 14 months and had now crossed the automatic logging threshold. His conclusion was a question, not a finding. Possible asteroid cluster migration. Recommend low priority. Confirmation scan at next scheduled maintenance window. Sethguy read it twice. He set it aside. He ate his dinner when it arrived. He thought about a trade negotiation with the Cathari collective that was giving him a headache, and about his youngest daughter's upcoming graduation ceremony, and about whether to recommend a tariff adjustment on imported navigational components. He did not think about the 0.003% variance. He slept 7 hours. He woke. He reviewed the morning brief, which contained nothing unusual. He attended 2 meetings. He drafted a memo on intelligence resource allocation. He had lunch at approximately the 14th hour of his day. He was reviewing personnel transfers when his desk terminal emitted a sound it had never emitted in 40 years of service. Not an alarm, a cascade alarm. Every priority tier simultaneously active. Sound was not designed to be heard. It was designed to make the person hearing it physically stand up, which it did. He was on his feet before he was fully conscious of having moved. The screen showed 318 simultaneous drive ignition events, positions, inner system, 4th through 7th orbital shells. Classification, unknown vessel type. Extreme high mass military. Configuration, status converging time to optimal engagement range of the Imperial defense platforms, 42 minutes. Sethgar did not waste time on disbelief. He pulled the raw data and ran the position plot himself. The ships were already inside the sensor perimeter, not approaching it inside. It already passed the outer buoy line, already past the mid-range intercept corridor, already inside the minimum response radius of the primary defense grid. He checked the detection log. The sensor net had registered nothing, not a gradual buildup, not a suspicious reading that had been missed, absolutely nothing. And then 318 ships. He understood then, not all at once but in sequence, the understanding arriving like cold water filling a room. They had been drifting, cold and dark with no active systems, for long enough that the gravitation variance had only just crossed the logging threshold at the precise moment. They no longer needed to be hidden. The 0.003%. Arbicky's boring report, 14 months of accumulation. They had arrived 14 months ago and simply waited, coasting on ballistic arcs for the moment to ignite. 42 minutes to optimal engagement range. He pulled up the planetary defense command and found it already in cascade response, but a cascade response designed for a threat arriving from outside the perimeter. The primary weapons platforms were oriented outward, rotating them inward to engage a threat already inside there. Minimum effective range would take longer than 42 minutes for most of the grid's heavy assets. The lighter point defense systems were already engaging. They would destroy some of the incoming ships, perhaps many of them, but not enough when the ships were already this close and moving with the momentum of 3-year ballistic runs that could not be easily redirected by small bursts of defensive fire. He ran the calculation 3 times. because the first two results did not seem possible. The third confirmed it. He opened a direct channel to Admiral Commander Vrankai, the highest-ranking military officer in the home system. The channel connected in seconds. "I see it," Vrankai said before Seth Kai could speak. His voice was flat. "I need your assessment of origin and doctrine." "Human," Seth Kai said immediately. "Mass ratios, the drive signatures now that they were active, the profiles matched colonial fleet vessel classes, larger than any previously catalogued configurations, but unmistakably human. I believe this is a response to the Aldrin Corridor incident." There was a brief silence on the channel. "That was 14 years ago." "Yes," Seth Kai said, "it was." Another silence. Vranka was not a man who wasted words, and the silence was not uncertainty. It was the particular quality of quiet that comes from a very disciplined mind processing a very unpleasant reality. "Options," Vranka said. "Limited. The grid cannot fully reorient. In time, we can engage with available point defense assets and inflict significant losses, but penetration of the inner system cannot be prevented. I recommend immediate evacuation of non-essential personnel from the command platforms and the orbital infrastructure, and a surrender offer." Setho paused. He had been thinking about this since the first moment he understood what he was looking at. A civilization that had spent 3 years in cold darkness to get here, that had subjected hundreds or thousands of crew members to years of discomfort and isolation and danger with no guarantee of success, was not a civilization that had come for a negotiation. "We can offer it," he said carefully. "I would not expect it to stop them." "Why not?" Setho looked at the plot on his screen. 318 points of light moving inward, steady and unhurried with the patience of something that had already done the hard part. "Because they didn't come here quickly," he said. "They came here slowly for 3 years in the dark. A civilization that does this is not looking for a way out. It is here to finish something it started a long time ago." Vrankow said nothing for a moment. "Then, send the offer anyway." "Yes, sir." Sethow began composing the formal surrender offer. His hands were steady. His mind was working. But underneath both of those things, something had shifted in a way that he could not quite name, a recognition, unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable, that he had spent 40 years building a picture of the galaxy and the threats in it, and that the picture had contained a significant error. He had known about the Aldrich. He had reviewed the incident files afterward, the casualty counts, the formal response. He had been in the room when someone had drafted those 3 words. He had not objected. The humans were a minor power. Their territory was small. Their military capacity was unremarkable. Their grief was not his directorate's concern. He had been wrong about what their grief would become. He finished the offer and transmitted it on all colonial fleet frequencies. Then he opened a second channel to the Imperial communication relay and began composing a different message. Personal 1. It was addressed to no one specific. It was addressed to the record. He wrote, "The sensor network did not fail. It worked as designed. It detected exactly what it was calibrated to detect. The threat was calibrated to produce nothing detectable. This is the distinction. We built a perfect system for finding the things we knew to look For they built a perfect thing for being invisible for 3 years while we watched. I'm recording this because I wanted on record that the failure was not technical, it was a failure of imagination. We did not ask what a civilization with nothing to lose and everything to avenge would be willing to endure. We should have asked. He sent it. He returned to his tactical screen. 39 minutes now. The pale light of incoming drive signatures filled his monitor like a field of new stars, each one moving with quiet, terrible purpose toward the heart of the empire he had spent his life protecting. He could not look away from them. He found to his own surprise that he did not want to. There was something in the sight of them 318 points of light that had been cold and dark for 3 years and were now burning hot and close and unstoppable. That demanded to be witnessed. He watched them come. I've been asked many times since that day what it felt like when the order went out. It felt like nothing. I want to be honest about that. There was no rush of feeling, no moment of release. I had been holding this plan in my hands for 11 years. The moment of execution felt less like beginning and more like a door closing. Something had been in motion for a very long time, and now the last chapter of it was beginning, and my only job was to see it through with the same precision and care that had brought us here. I gave the order at 500 Fleet Standard time with a text command sent down the fiber lines to all 318 ships. 2 words: ignite now. Across 4,000 km of grouped fleet space, 318 drives lit simultaneously. For a moment the passive scopes went white, the light of our own ignition reflecting back at us from the metamaterial hull coatings. Then the coatings shifted mode automatically and the view cleared, and I could see the fleet around me properly. For the first time in 3 years. It was not a beautiful sight in the way that people romanticize space battles. It was a functional sight. 318 vessels of varying class and size, arranged in the attack formation we had drilled for years in simulation, now moving with purpose through outer orbital shell of a pale blue star system that had never once seen us coming. Owen Hale's voice came over the bridge speaker's actual voice for the first time since the silence protocol began. His throat was rough from disuse, and he cleared it before speaking. Tactical is active. I have firing solutions on the primary orbital platforms. Defense grid is reorienting. It's slow. Their heavy assets are facing outward. They need time to rotate. How much time? I asked. More than we're going to give them, he said. That was the calculation. The Volca defense grid was extraordinary. In 11 years of planning, I had never found a way to beat it head-on. You could not come at it from outside and win, but coming at it from inside, from a position already past its optimal engagement envelope, changed the geometry completely. The grid had been built to stop threats arriving from outside. We were not arriving from outside. We were already here. The first engagements began within 4 minutes of ignition. I will describe them plainly, without flourish, because they were not glorious. They were the consequence of years of planning, meeting a target that had, until 40 minutes ago, been entirely unaware of our existence. The point defense platforms reacted. Fastest, small automated weapon systems that could reorient quickly. They engaged 6 of our leading ships before Our own countermeasures adapted. Carrier Dunmore took a direct hit on its port drive array and lost propulsion. Captain Helen Ford immediately signaled that her crew was stable and requested permission to proceed on secondary drives. Permission granted. She brought the Dunmore forward on half thrust, and it remained in the engagement. The carrier Linton was less fortunate. A sequence of 3 hits from a platform that had been positioned at an angle that gave it better coverage of our approach vector caught her broadside. The Linton had no time to maneuver. She vented atmosphere from 3 sections and lost contact 22 seconds later. 216. Crew members Captain Dale Sutton, Flight Officer Cara Page, Engineer's Mate Patrick Good, Medic Nora Shaw. 212 others whose names I have recorded and will not forget. The Aldebaran went silent 40 minutes into the engagement. Drive failure. Cause unknown. Final message from Captain Roy Miles. Drive is out. We're going manual. Tell them we came anyway. The carriers Price and Halden were struck in the same 4-minute window by a volley from a heavy platform that had finally managed partial reorientation. The Price lost her command section. The Halden lost her medical bay and 2 decks below it. Both continued to fight. 7 ships in total before it was over. I will not list them all now because I cannot do it with the speed this account requires, and they deserve more than speed. They deserve the full weight of their names read carefully in a quiet room. I will provide that accounting elsewhere in full. What I will say here is that losing 7 ships out of 318 against the defense grid of the most powerful empire in known space while operating from inside a firing envelope that grid had never been tested against was not a military miracle. It was the result of 11 years of preparation meeting 11 years of precision. The tribute we owe those 7 crews is not to call their loss acceptable. No, loss is acceptable. The tribute is to say that what they were part of was real and mattered and achieved what it set out to achieve. 44 minutes after ignition, the primary orbital defense platforms of the Vika home system went offline. Not all destroyed, several were simply cut off their communication lines, severed their coordination links, eliminated their ability to function as a grid rather than a collection of isolated weapons. Removed an isolated weapon is dangerous. A grid that cannot coordinate is manageable. The surrender offer came in at the 48-minute mark. I received it on the command channel and read it twice. It was formal and correctly worded. It offered full cessation of hostilities, transfer of command authority, and compliance with Colonial Compact regulations for occupied systems. It also contained a secondary transmission encrypted on a frequency our intelligence teams had flagged from Vakai diplomatic channels 14 years ago. The secondary transmission was not addressed to anyone in the fleet. Our communications officer, Lieutenant Delia Grant, pulled it from the signal and ran it through analysis in 11 seconds. It was a biological dispersal drone, launched from the 3rd orbital platform, simultaneously with the surrender transmission programmed to intercept the Arclight's approach vector. The payload was a pathogen our medical teams had cataloged and prepared for, one of 6 contingency biological agents we had identified in Vakai military archives during the intelligence gathering phase of planning. They had offered to stop they had also, at the same moment, sent something designed to ensure that even if we accepted the offer, there would be consequences. I was not surprised. I want to be clear about that. I had run this scenario in planning sessions 17 times. A civilization that fires on a civilian transport and sends a message saying you are welcome does not, under pressure, become a civilization that surrenders with clean hands. I had prepared for it. The carrier Whitmore had been assigned to intercept duties for this contingency. Captain Bex Harlow and her crew had been briefed fully on what intercept duty meant, that if this scenario materialized, they would be placing their ship in the path of a biological dispersal device. They had been given 30 days to back out of the assignment with no mark on their record. None of them had backed out. The Whitmore moved to intercept position without a command from me. Bex Harlow acted on standing orders and her own judgment. The drone was detonated at safe distance. Before it could complete its approach, the Whitmore took radiation exposure across her outer hull and significant contamination of her forward sections. Captain Harlow reported 2 crew members requiring immediate medical attention. The rest of the ship was functional. Her message to the fleet was 5 words. Whitmore confirms intercept, all clear. I added Bex Harlow and the crew of the Whitmore to the section of I keep for people who have done something I cannot adequately thank them for. I accepted the Vorkai surrender at 7:22 Fleet Standard Time. I transmitted acceptance on the formal channel and informed the Imperial Command that Colonial Compact occupation protocols were now in effect. I instructed all fleet elements to maintain current positions and cease offensive action. The Vorkai home system went quiet. Not silent, ships were still moving. Platforms were still spinning. The enormous infrastructure of an 11 system empire continued its mechanical routines. But the commanding voice of the empire, the network of signals and orders and responses that had spoken continuously for 400 years, fell still. I sat in my chair and looked at the pale blue star. Owen Hale said quietly, "That's it." Then I said, "Yes." He looked at me for a moment. "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly before I answered, because Owen deserved an honest answer. "Cold," I said. "I still feel cold." He nodded, and neither of us said anything else for a while. And outside the viewports, the pale blue star of the Vorkai home system continued to burn, completely indifferent to the fact that everything beneath it had just changed forever. My name is Selene Morrow, and I was in my office on the Kithari Collective's Deep Space Observation platform when the Vorkai went silent. I had been a Galactic Affairs correspondent for 22 years. I had covered the Harani expansion, the Tessari civil conflict, the collapse of the Outer Belt Trading Federation. I had watched empires grow and shrink and occasionally shatter. I had a reputation for being difficult to surprise. The morning of the silence, I was working on a completely unrelated piece about trade route adjustments in the third quadrant. My monitoring system flagged an anomaly at 8:23 Kithari Standard Time, and I assumed it was a signal degradation issue because the alternative, that the Vorkai Imperial transmission grid had simply stopped broadcasting, was not something I had a category for. I ran the diagnostic myself. The grid was functioning, the receiving arrays were functioning, every technical element of the signal pathway between the Volca home system and my office was working perfectly. The Volca home system had simply stopped broadcasting. I pulled up the deep space signal archive and traced backward the last transmission from the Imperial Command network had gone out at 7:18 Cathari Standard Time. It was a routine logistics update for supply vessels operating in the second and fourth quadrant corridors. Completely ordinary. The kind of message that got sent dozens of times a day and that no analyst anywhere had ever thought to pay attention to. After 7:18 there was nothing. I called the Cathari Intelligence Bureau. The duty officer, a careful man named Oliver Crane, who had been running that desk for 15 years and had the temperament of someone who had stopped being rattled by things a long time ago, picked up on the second signal. "We know," he said before I could speak. "What is it?" "We don't know yet," and then which was not something Oliver Crane had ever said to me in 15 years. "We genuinely do not know." Over the next 3 hours I pieced together what was happening from the signal traffic of 6 other spacefaring civilizations who were all independently trying to understand the same thing. The Lithian Confederation had scrambled a survey vessel to the edge of Volca space and was waiting for sensor returns. The Harani Union had convened an emergency council session. 2 smaller polities, the Vithran Compact and the Asari Conclave, had each independently recalled their ambassadors from Volca diplomatic stations, not because they had been asked to, but because their ambassadors were suddenly unreachable. Every civilization that shared a border with the Volca Empire or operated within its economic reach or had at any point in the last century been in diplomatic contact with its government was doing the same thing at the same time, trying to find out what had happened and failing. The Lithian survey vessel sensor return came in at approximately the 5th hour. I obtained a copy through a contact I will not name. The return showed the Volca home system operating normally in terms of stellar mechanics, the star burning the planets, orbiting the artificial structures, maintaining their positions, but the signal profile of the system had changed completely. Where there had previously been thousands of daily transmissions in dozens of formats across dozens of frequencies, there was now a single organized signal, colonial fleet, standard broadcast format, encryptions, consistent with colonial fleet communications doctrine. The Volca Empire was not destroyed. It was occupied. The question that hit me the moment I understood this was not how. The how would come later, and when it did, it would be extraordinary. The question that hit me first was by whom, because no military force in known space had been detected moving toward Volca territory. No fleet had been tracked. No deployment had been logged. The Volca sensor net, the finest detection apparatus in the galaxy, had not flagged a single inbound threat. I had been covering galactic affairs for 22 years, and I had never covered a story in which a military action of this scale had occurred with zero for warning, not reduced for warning, not late warning. Zero, an empire present and operational at 7:18, occupied and silent by 8:20. At approximately the 11th hour after the silence began, the transmission came through. It was broadcast simultaneously on every known galactic communication frequency. Colonial fleet encoding, clear and unencrypted, addressed to no specific recipient. My monitoring system flagged it along with every other monitoring system in Cathari space, and I listened to it 3 times before I was able to process it fully. The transmission was brief. Approximately 90 seconds of audio, read in a flat, even voice. Subsequent analysis confirmed the voice as Admiral Maravas, commanding officer of the United Human Colonial Fleet's 7th Strike Arm, a name that had appeared in Colonial Fleet organizational charts, but had not previously been associated with any significant military operation. The transmission stated the following. 14 years prior, the civilian transport vessel Aldrich, carrying 40,000 colonial citizens including children, had been fired upon by Vakai Imperial forces in the outer corridor of what the Vakai had unilaterally declared an expansion zone. The attack had resulted in the loss of 39,989 lives. The Colonial Council had sought accountability through diplomatic channels on 9 separate occasions over the subsequent decade. The Vakai Empire had not engaged with any of these requests in good faith. The 7th Strike Arm had therefore conducted an accountability action under the authority of the Colonial Compacts, Article 14, which provides for military response to acts of mass harm against civilian populations when diplomatic remedies have been exhausted. The Valkai home system and its associated orbital infrastructure were now under colonial fleet occupation, pending the establishment of an accountability tribunal. All civilian Valkai populations were safe and would remain so. Imperial military assets had been secured. Occupation protocols in accordance with Colonial Compact regulation were in effect. Any party wishing to review the full evidence record could request access through the colonial diplomatic channel. The transmission ended. I listened to it a 4th time, then a 5th. I've been a journalist for 22 years. I have learned to process information with some degree of distance to separate my own reaction from the analytical work of understanding what I am being told. That discipline mostly held, I was able to note the careful formal language. I was able to note what was not in the transmission. No threats, no declarations of ongoing hostility, no demands directed at other civilizations. I was able to observe that it was the most legally precise military statement I had ever heard, citing specific article numbers from a multilateral compact framing a military action as a legal process rather than a conquest. What my analytical distance could not quite manage was the arithmetic. 40,000 people, 14 years, 3 years of cold darkness in a fleet that should not have been able to get within detection range of the most powerful empire in the galaxy, and at the end of all of it, a 90-second transmission that cited regulatory articles and offered to share the evidence with anyone who wanted to review it. I wrote 3 different opening paragraphs for my initial dispatch and deleted all 3. The 4th one, which I eventually sent, began, "The Valkai Empire has not been at war. It has been served in accounting. The reaction across the galactic community in the hours and days that followed covered a very wide range. Some of it was fear, pure, simple, and I think entirely understandable. civilization that nobody had been watching closely had just demonstrated the capacity to move 318 warships undetected into the heart of the most heavily defended system in known space and neutralize it in under 2 hours. The implications of that capability were not lost on anyone who had ever given any thought to their own systems, defenses. Some of it was relief. The Volca Empire had not been gentle with its neighbors. Over the past century, and more than a few civilizations learned about the occupation and spent the following hours quietly reviewing their own diplomatic archives, looking for disputes they might want to resolve before any further accountability actions were conducted by anyone. Some of it was something harder to categorize. I spent 3 days conducting interviews, talking to analysts and officials and ordinary citizens across the collective, and I kept encountering the same thing, a reaction that did not fit cleanly into fear or relief or outrage, a kind of unsettled recognition, the sense that something had been revealed about the humans that required the previous picture to be updated substantially. The Harani ambassador to the Cathari collective said it most plainly in an off-the-record conversation that he subsequently gave me permission to attribute. He said, "We have been thinking of them as a small power with large feelings. We were wrong about the small part." I kept coming back to one specific detail of what had happened, not the fleet size, not the tactical execution, not the outcome, the duration. 3 years of power down transit in the cold, in silence with no certainty of success. I found records indicating that the crew rotation protocol for the mission had included a provision for crew members who experienced psychological deterioration from the conditions to be replaced at the last resupply stop 18 months into the transit. Of the 11,400 crew members across the fleet who had reached that resupply stop, exactly 0 had requested removal from the mission. 11,400 people, 3 years of cold and dark and silence, and not a single one of them had asked to leave. I found that number more illuminating than any tactical assessment I read in the following weeks. Military capability can be built with enough resources and enough time. The question that mattered more, the question that the Harani ambassador's comment was really circling without quite reaching, was about what kind of people would choose to endure what those crews had endured. The answer, I came to believe, was not complicated. It was people who had 40,000 names in their heads and had decided, collectively and individually, that those names were worth 3 years in the cold. My editor sent me a request 9 days after the occupation began for a follow-up piece. The proposed title was, "Are Humans a Threat to the Cathari Collective?" I looked at the request for a long time. I thought about what I had learned over the preceding 9 days. I thought about the transmission and the tribunal proceedings that were now beginning, and the careful regulatory language and the offer to share evidence with anyone who wanted it. Then I thought about the Aldrich, about Lucy Ferrero, who was now 20 years old and had grown up without her mother, about the 39,989 names that had never been properly accounted for, not in 14 years of diplomatic requests in formal channels and correct and patient process. I wrote back to my editor. I said, "That is the wrong question. The right question is what the Vasai did to deserve this and whether any other civilization want to check their own records before they decide how to feel about the answer. My editor sent back a single reply: run with it. The piece I wrote was not what he expected. It was not a fear piece or a threat assessment. It was a reconstruction of the Aldrich incident in full: the timeline, the communications, the casualty figures, the diplomatic attempts, the response that said, "You are welcome." It was the story that had been sitting in the colonial record for 14 years, available to anyone who looked, that no major galactic publication had ever run in full, because the Vase were powerful and the humans were considered a minor concern. It ran on every major publication in the Cathari Collective and was picked up by 14 other civilizations' news networks. Within 48 hours, I received in the following week more reader messages than I had received in the previous 22 years combined. Many of them were from non-human readers who said some version of the same thing, that they had not known that they had seen the humans as a curiosity at best, an irritant at worst, that they had not known about the Aldrich. Some of them said, having learned about it, that they understood now, that they did not necessarily agree with everything that had happened or endorse the methods or feel comfortable with what a fleet of that capability implied for the future, but that they understood why it had happened. That seemed right to me. Understanding is not the same as approval, but it is the beginning of accuracy, and accuracy is the beginning of everything else. I filed one final piece on the 30th day after the occupation began. It ended with a paragraph that I think, of everything I have ever written, comes closest to capturing what I was actually trying to say. I wrote, "The Valk I learned too late that there is a particular kind of opponent that is more dangerous than any weapon, not the one that strikes quickly, not the one that strikes powerfully, the one that does not forget, does not waver, and is willing to be cold for 3 years in the dark on the chance that it will matter." The humans did not come here to be feared. They came here to be accurate. Distinction may be the most important thing the rest of us learned from this. It was raining when I landed. Not a dramatic rain, not the kind that announces itself. Just a steady, unremarkable autumn rain, in the way that the city of Bristol does. Rain, persistent and gray, and somehow comfortable in a way that rain only is when you have been away from it for long enough. I stood on the tarmac outside the arrivals terminal for 11 minutes. I knew the exact time because I checked the mechanical watch, force of habit. The rain soaked through my jacket almost immediately. An officer from the ground crew approached me with a cover, and I waved her off, not rudely, just with the clear indication that I was choosing to stand in the rain and did not require assistance. She gave me a look that I recognized, the look of someone trying to figure out how to act around a person who has just done something very large in a very public way, and deciding that giving her some space was the correct choice. She was right. I had not been on Earth in 4 years and 2 months. I had forgotten the smell of the place. I do not mean that sentimentally. I mean it literally. The olfactory memory of planetary air, of wet concrete and cut grass, and the particular quality of wind that has traveled over land rather than recycled through a filtration system, is the kind of sensory information that fades faster than you expect when you have been living in recycled shipboard atmosphere. Standing in the rain, I remembered it. All at once, I picked up my bag eventually and went. Inside, the terminal had been cleared for our arrival, which I had not asked for and did not particularly want, but which the Colonial Council's protocol office had arranged without consulting me. There was a small group of officials waiting, civilian liaisons, a council representative I recognized from the pre-mission briefings, 2 people in Colonial Fleet dress uniform whose faces I did not know. There was no crowd, no ceremony. I had specifically and in writing requested no ceremony. The request had been honored, which I was grateful for. The council representative's name was Graham Forth. He was a compact, practical man in his late 50s who had the efficient manner of someone who spends most of his professional life managing situations that other people have created. He had been the civilian oversight contact for the mission since year 2 of planning. I had spoken to him exactly twice, both times via encrypted text channel. He shook my hand now with the straightforward grip of a person who is not trying to perform anything. "Welcome back," he said. "Thank you," I said. He looked at my wet jacket and did not comment on it. "There is a situation briefing whenever you're ready. No urgency. We suggest 48 hours of personal time first." "I'll take the briefing now," I said. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "Of course." The briefing room was on the 3rd floor, clean, neutral, the kind of room that has been designed to contain difficult conversations without amplifying them. I sat across from Graham Forth and 2 analysts I was introduced to and immediately forgot the names of, and for 3 hours I listened to what the galaxy had been doing while I had been getting wet on a tarmac. The political situation was, in the clinical language of the briefing, materials complex and evolving. 3 civilizations had recalled their ambassadors from colonial diplomatic station, not issued formal protests, simply recalled their ambassadors without explanation, which in diplomatic terms is more serious than a protest, because it is harder to respond to. 2 of them were civilizations that had trade relationships with the Voikai that were now in uncertain status. One of them, the Lithian Confederation, had no formal Voikai relationships that anyone had identified and had recalled its ambassador for reasons that Graham Foote described as unclear and possibly precautionary. 2 other civilizations had requested urgent diplomatic meetings. One was the Harani Union, which had a long history of territorial friction with the Volkai and was, according to the briefing, primarily interested in understanding the extent of colonial fleet capabilities and the likelihood of further accountability actions. The other was the Asari Conclave, which had no current conflicts with humanity, but was, according to the briefing, reassessing its regional threat modeling. A phrase I noticed was carefully chosen to avoid saying that they were now afraid of us. I asked Graham Foote directly, how many of these civilizations are genuinely concerned about what we did and how many are concerned that we could do it to them? He considered the question seriously before answering. Some of both. The ones with clean records are mostly in the first group. The ones with complicated histories are mostly in the second. Good, I said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. I did not explain. I had spent 11 years building capacity with a specific purpose, and The most useful secondary effect of that capacity being demonstrated was the one he had just described, a civilization that has given its neighbors no reason to consider accountability, does not fear accountability being pursued. The ones that were afraid knew why they were afraid. After the briefing, I was assigned quarters in a facility that I would charitably describe as adequate. I was told that a press engagement had been tentatively scheduled for 2 days hence, and that my attendance was requested, but not required. I said I would attend. I was told that the Colonial Council had voted in closed session the day before my return to formally designate the 7th Strike Arms action as a lawful accountability operation under Article 14 of the Colonial Compact, which meant that neither I nor any member of my crew was subject to legal review under colonial law. I said thank you for the information and went to my quarters. The first thing I did was take a shower, of the kind you can only take when the water does not have to be recycled. The second thing I did was call my sister. Her name is Nell. She is 3 years younger than me and has spent the last 4 years not knowing whether I was alive. I had been able to send her 3 brief messages over the course of the transit. Brief because they were routed through deep space relay at intervals that would not produce a detectable signal, informing her that I was well. She had known broadly what the mission was. She had not known the full scope of it until the transmission went out. The call connected after 4 rings. She was in her kitchen. She looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "Your hair is a mess." "I know," I said. "Are you okay?" I thought about the honest answer to that. "I'm tired," I said. "I'm very tired." "Come and have dinner," she said. I went the following evening. Nell lives 40 minutes from the facility by public transport. I took the train wearing civilian clothes and no insignia, and no one recognized me, which I was quietly glad about. I sat by the window and watched the countryside move past hills and farmland and small towns in the ordinary texture of a planet that had been living its life while I had been away, and I felt the strangeness of return in a way that I had not allowed myself to feel during the briefing or the tarmac or the facility. 4 years away from this, 4 years in the cold and the dark and the machinery of something that had to be done. And now here was ordinary land with ordinary people in it going about the business of ordinary lives, and they were what it had all been for, and I was struggling to find the bridge between the two things. Nell made a fish pie that was better than anything I had eaten in 4 years, and made no reference whatsoever to the Volkai Empire, which was the most generous thing anyone had done for me since I landed. We talked about her daughter, who was 7 and had recently developed a strong opinion about horses. We talked about the house she was thinking of buying. We talked about a show she had been watching that she insisted I would enjoy once I had the time. We talked about our father, who had died 2 years into my transit and whose service I had not been able to attend. I had known about it for 18 months. Already by then, the delayed communication had arrived during the resupply window. I had read the message and I had cried for 20 minutes alone in my quarters, and then I had gotten up and gone back to work because there was nothing else to be done. I told Nell I was sorry I had not been there. She said she knew. She said Dad had known too in the way That people know things about the people. They love without being told, she said. He had been proud, she said this quietly, and without drama, and I believed her, and it hurt in the way that true things hurt. When you have been holding them at distance for a long time. After dinner, Nell's daughter, her name is Elsa, came downstairs in her pajamas to say good night and caught sight of me and asked Nell who I was. Nell said I was her Aunt Mara, who had been away for a very long time. Elsa looked at me with the frank curiosity of a 7-year-old and asked where I had been. I said I had been working. She asked what kind of work. I said the kind that takes a long time to finish. She seemed to find this acceptable and went back upstairs, and I looked at Nell, and Nell looked at me, and we both let the moment be what it was. I visited the Aldrich Memorial on my 3rd day back. It is in central London, a wide, low space set below street level so that you descend into it from the busy city above, and the transition is deliberate. The surface world with all its noise and motion drops away as you walk down the steps, and you arrive in a space that is quiet and open and asks something of you. The names are carved into black stone, not arranged alphabetically or by category, arranged by family unit, the way the passenger manifest had organized them, parents and children together. It had been a deliberate choice by the memorial's designers to preserve the fact that most of the 40,000 had not been individuals traveling alone. They had been families, they had been together. I walked along the wall slowly. I found the 3 names I had been looking for. A woman named Brenda, who had been my senior navigation instructor at the Colonial Fleet Academy when I was 22. Her husband Paul, her son Owen, who had been 8 years old and who I had met once at an academy function when he was 5. I stood in front of their names for a long time, not saying anything, not doing anything particular, just standing there in the way that you stand somewhere that deserves to be stood in. There were other visitors, a man about my age who stood very still in one section for nearly 20 minutes and then left without looking at anyone. A family group, a mother and 2 teenage children who moved along the wall together quietly. An elderly woman who sat on one of the memorial benches for a long time with her hands folded. Nobody recognized me, or if they did, they kept it to themselves. I was grateful for that. I had been asked in the days since landing a number of times whether I was proud by officials, by the 2 people in dress uniform in the terminal, by a council aide who had clearly meant it as a compliment. It was a natural question. It was meant kindly. I did not know how to answer it in a way that would not seem evasive or ungrateful. Standing at the Aldrich Memorial, I found the answer, or at least the beginning of one. Pride implies that you have received something, a feeling of achievement, of gain. I had not gained anything by what we had done. We had closed something. We had made good on a debt of accountability that should never have been allowed to accumulate for 14 years. The action had been necessary, and it had been executed with care, and the people who had done it with extraordinary commitment and courage and endurance. But 40,000 names were still in the stone. Brenda Cole and Paul Cole and Owen Cole, who had been 5 years old when I met him, was still in the stone. Nothing that happened in the Vorkuta home system had taken them out of the stone. What we had done was ensure that those names were not simply endured, but answered. That was different from pride. That was closer to a kind of sorrow that has been honored, not healed, but honored, the recognition that some debts cannot be paid but can be acknowledged with full weight, and that acknowledgement matters even when it cannot undo the harm. I stood until the light changed and the afternoon began to turn toward evening. Then I went back up the steps to the surface world with all its noise and motion. I had been walking for about 10 minutes when my communication unit chimed with a message. I almost ignored it. I had been doing a reasonable job of ignoring official communications for 3 days, but the sender code showed it was from the colonial detention facility at Port Casper, which was where Sethkai Alvrin was being held pending the accountability tribunal. He had sent a written message. It had been reviewed and cleared by facility security and the council liaison before reaching me as per standard protocol. It said, I need to understand something. You had the capability to demand our surrender long before you came to the home system. At any point in the transit, you could have revealed your position and demanded compliance. We would have had no choice. Why did you not do this? Why go all the way through? I am not asking to argue. I am asking because I genuinely do not understand, and I find that I need to. I read it on a busy London street with people moving past me in both directions. In the ordinary rain of an ordinary afternoon, I thought about Brenda Cole. I thought about Elsa asking where I had been and what kind of work took a long time. I thought about Owen Hale asking how I felt, and about Bex Harlow's 5-word message. I thought about the Lethbridge's crew sealing a cold bay by hand in the dark with no complaint. I thought about what Sethkai had written in his own record at the moment he understood what was coming, that the failure was not technical but a failure of imagination. I composed my reply carefully. I wrote several drafts and deleted them. The final version was 2 sentences. Surrender requires trust. You showed us 14 years ago what your promises are worth. I sent it and blocked further correspondence. I continued walking. The rain picked up slightly. I turned my collar up and kept going. I thought about the people I had brought home, 11,000, and some who had gone out cold and come back with stories they would carry for the rest of their lives. I thought about the ones I had not brought home, the crews of the 7 ships, 200 and some names that I was still working through properly, that deserved the accounting I was going to give them in the full record when I had the time and the quiet to do it right. I thought about what Selene Morrow had written in her dispatch, which someone had forwarded to me during the briefing, that we had not come to be feared, that we had come to be accurate. I thought that was right. Accurate was the right word. We had done something that needed to be done as precisely and as carefully and as responsibly as we could manage, and we had done it with full knowledge of the cost. The cost was real. I was not going to pretend otherwise. 7 ships, the crew of the Whitmore carrying radiation exposure home in their cells. Owen Hale's rough voice clearing from disuse. 4 years of my sister not knowing. My father's funeral I did not attend. Cold that I could still feel in my hands and in my joints even now on a mild autumn evening on a wet London street. Because 3 years of 4 degrees does something to you that a week of normal temperature does not fully undo. The cost was real, and I was not proud of having paid it. I was glad it had been paid. Those are different things. I wound the watch. The small clicking sound was familiar in a way that very little else was yet. Sound that had been with me through the whole thing, the only constant between then and now. My grandfather had given it to me when I was 19 and told me that mechanical things teach you patience because they require you to attend to them. He meant it as practical advice about maintenance. I had found it to be true in a larger sense. Patience, attention, the willingness to do a thing slowly in the dark with no guarantee of outcome because the thing needed to be done. I put the watch in my jacket pocket and turned toward the station. The rain was just rain. The city was just the city. Somewhere 11,000 people were finding their way back to their own ordinary worlds, to their own families, and ordinary streets, and the smell of planetary air that had faded and then returned. I was very tired. I thought that was exactly the right way to feel. I went to find my train home.